Good evening. I'm Mark Cantor, President of the Jewish Heritage Centre of Western Canada. Welcome to this evening's program, the 2022 Switzer-Cooperstock Lecture. Congratulations to this year's winners, Professors Lynne and Jordan Stanger-Ross. At this time, I would like to acknowledge that we are hosting this event from our homes on Treaty 1 land, traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, and Dakota peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. The mission of the Jewish Heritage Centre of Western Canada is to document, preserve, and share information on the culture and history of Jewish communities in Western Canada. The Centre also serves as an advocate for anti-racism and education on the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. I encourage you to visit our website at jhcwc.org and learn more of our organization and upcoming events. I'd now like to turn it over to Dan Stone.
Hello, I'm Daniel Stone, the chair of the Programs and Exhibits Committee and convener of the Switzer-Cooperstock Prize Committee. It's a pleasure once again to bring you the Switzer-Cooperstock Prize Lecture. The prize was established in 2008 and has contributed to scholarship in Western Canada, bringing to attention a number of subjects that might otherwise be missed. Prize winners generally come from Canada, but they also include scholars from Israel and France. Now I'd like to introduce the initiator of the prize, Professor Paul Switzer, who speaks on behalf of the Switzer-Cooperstock family. Professor Paul Switzer comes from Winnipeg, where he attended St. John's Tech and the University of Manitoba before going to Harvard for graduate work. He has had a very distinguished career at Stanford University, where he is Professor Emeritus of Statistics. Much of his work has been on environmental issues. Professor Switzer has held visiting professorships around the world, France, Italy, Japan, and many others. He has been our main contact with developing and continuing the Switzer-Cooperstock Prize, and now I invite him to speak on behalf of the family.
Great, thanks, Dan. It's a pleasure for me to have the honor once again to welcome you to the Switzer-Cooperstock Prize lecture. And so on behalf of myself, my brother Fred, I would like to say just a little bit about who this prize honors. So in the background behind me, you see a photograph of my parents, and this prize is in their honor. Both of my parents were born in Ukraine and immigrated to Manitoba in the early part of the 20th century. They met in 1936 and were married, and Fred and I are here today to once again honor them. I should mention their names. My mother is Rocheleia Cooperstock Switzer, and my father is Louis Labus Switzer. Okay, I'd like to mention also who I am. So I'm known probably to most of you as Penny Switzer, which is a name that my parents gave me and that I grew up with in Winnipeg and still use. I'd like to mention also that when Dan introduced me and gave my educational background, he left out actually the most important part of my educational background in Winnipeg. That is my attendance at the Parents Volksschule in Winnipeg, which was a Yiddish language day school, and I consider my formation, Parents School, as one of the most important things fortunate and important things that happened to me as I was growing up. And I thank my parents so much for having had the foresight to send me and also my brother Fred to the Parachute. Okay, so now having given my little spiel, I'm very much looking forward to today's lecture and the prize lecturers. Congratulations to the prize recipients, Jordan Stanger-Ross and Lynne Marks. And I'm very much looking forward to the presentation. And I'll turn it back to Dan Stone, who will introduce the prize recipients.
Thank you, Paul. The Switzer-Cooperstock Prize is awarded biennially for the best essay on Jewish history in Western Canada. It's open to all. Most winners have been professors, but not everyone. Winners are selected by an independent jury of 3 individuals with appropriate professional qualifications. As before, mostly professors, but there are other people with appropriate qualifications. A student prize is now offered in alternate years, and I encourage professors to encourage their students to submit entries next year. Next spring, there will be ads out sometime fairly soon. And anyone else who has family members or other students who with an interest in Jewish history, please encourage them to get in touch with us. Previous talks have raised a variety of issues: farm colonies, religion, relations with indigenous communities, Canadian Medicare and the Jewish role in that, growing up in smaller prairie cities, visiting rabbis of the 1920s, the Winnipeg Jewish Orphanage, and anarchists in Winnipeg. Tonight's presentation involves Holocaust remembrance and raises very interesting questions about relations with the indigenous community. After the talk, which is projected at about 40 to 45 minutes, the question and answer period. Please remember to put your questions and comments in the Q&A line for the speakers to see. Use the chat line for discussions among yourselves, but things there will not necessarily end up at the Q&A. Now for the speakers, who will trade off at a certain point. Professor Jordan Stanger-Ross is a faculty fellow at the Center for Global Studies at the University of Victoria. He's professor of history and director of Landscapes of Injustice, a multi-year project about the property of Japanese Canadians in the 1940s. His continuing work in this area of anti-Japanese activity has won him university appointment as Provost's Engaged Scholar. Professor Stanger-Ross did his undergraduate degree at McGill and his graduate work at the University of Pennsylvania. In his university career, he's won awards for scholarship, museum work, heritage work, and community engagement. In addition to his focus on the Japanese community, Professor Stanger-Ross maintains an interest in Jewish history, as evidenced by articles, book reviews, and presentations, such as tonight. His co-worker in this jointly written paper, Lynne Marks, is professor of history also at the University of Victoria. She studied at the University of Toronto and York University. Author of numerous books and articles on religious history, she has a gift for titles, I think, such as the 2018 award-winning book, Infidels and the Damned Churches. In 2010, Professor Marks won the Switzer-Cooperstock Award for her essay, Not Being Religious Didn't Take Away from Their Jewishness, about Jewish identity in British Columbia in the decades just before the First World War. Now to the talk, but let me remind audience members to put their questions and comments on the Q&A line. Jordan, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Dan, and to the Switzer family for establishing the prize and the committee for honoring our essay. It's a real pleasure to be here for both Lynne and me, I know. I want to start today's talk by painting a scene, or attempting to paint a scene, but as you'll see, I struggle to do so. So I'll beg your indulgence to work with me to try to envision the scene that I'm conjuring. It's 7 p.m. on November 7th, 2019, in the historic synagogue in Victoria. The shul is packed. With every seat on the main floor occupied, congregants spill into the upper balcony of the historic synagogue, making room for distinguished guests on the ground floor. And the room buzzes. It has the hum of a room in which something exciting is about to happen. I don't know if that is a feeling that's familiar, but a room where there's kind of a hum in the room of anticipation and conversation. Everybody knows that they're there at an event, some kind of major event. For the 31st time, congregants from Congregation Emmanuel, members of the general public, and distinguished guests prepare to commemorate Kristallnacht in memory of the violence that occurred in November 1938 in Nazi Germany and Austria. It's difficult, as I've suggested, to convey the atmosphere in the room. As a young person, I have to say that I grew up somewhat repelled by Holocaust commemoration. I found it dark and often depressing, repetitive, and I thought politically regressive. It tended to be accompanied, I thought, at least by a message that Jews were very much alone in the world, very much threatened, that we had to defend our tribe. And for me, that wasn't a message that resonated. And that's how I received that Holocaust education, and I sort of moved away from it. So the atmosphere before Kristallnacht in Victoria in 2019 astounded me. This felt like an exciting place to be. And I'm not the only one who struggled to describe that atmosphere, especially given that it's a commemoration of the Holocaust. Here, in the words of Misha Menzer, who helps to lead the congregation, is a similar lead the commemorations, is a similar kind of difficulty in description. It's proven, Misha told me, to be there aren't adjectives. Successful isn't the word, but actually successful probably is the word. As Menzer explains, the shul is packed. We probably get 150 to 180 people, young, old. We have the premier come. The chief of police always comes, bishops come, we have the imam come. In November 2019, these regulars were joined also by members of provincial cabinet, a member of the federal cabinet, and other civic leaders. Kristallnacht, Menzer notes, is basically on the calendar of important political events in British Columbia. Ed Fitch, a congregant who regularly attends, says, I don't know if one can use the word enjoyable, but somehow it is that. The most notable Holocaust commemoration in Victoria vibrates with positive energy, at least lately. Richard Kuhl, the master of ceremonies in 2019, began his opening remarks, and the crowd quieted in anticipation. Kuhl started with an acknowledgement of the kind that has in recent decades become common in Canada and that we heard at the beginning of this event. This congregation, Kuhl said, recognizes that our historic synagogue is built on the lands of the Lekwungen people. And we note the vibrant culture and ongoing contribution to the broader community of the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations, whose traditional lands we are on this evening and from which I give this talk. In this talk, Lynne and I want to do two things. The first, and this will be Lynne's role, is to suggest that these remarks at the beginning of the commemoration in 2019 and the wider engagement of settler colonial history in the ceremony is in some sense appropriate. They fit into the history of an institution that was critical to settler colonialism in Victoria. And Lynne will convey that history in just a moment. The second thing, when the talk returns to me, that we'll seek to do is to question the ways in which the congregation has been engaging settler colonialism in its commemorations. And I mean the word question in two ways. First, to simply ask questions about it. How did it arise over time and what's its significance? And then finally, to question in that other sense, to suggest that in some ways it may be problematic. This latter form of questioning is not intended necessarily to discourage engagement of settler colonialism in the commemorations, but at least to draw it into critical conversation, to ask how it's being done and to what end. So for the first part of this talk, I'll turn it over to Lynne Marks to suggest to convey a wider history of the congregation. Lynne.
Okay, thanks very much, Jordan. And I'd also like to thank Dan Stone and the Switzer-Cooperstock family. And I'm very happy to be presenting with Jordan today. And in case you're wondering, the synagogue we're talking about is behind me in my background. It's still the synagogue that is used today for various worship and Kristallnacht's commemorations, and it goes back, as I'll be talking about, for more than 150 years. So I'm providing, as Jordan said, some context here for the larger paper by acknowledging the deep colonial roots of the congregation we're talking about. Before 1843, the population of the area that became Victoria had been entirely Indigenous. This changed a little bit with the fur trade, but it changed dramatically in 1853 with the gold rush on the Fraser River, which led to a dramatic expansion of the non-Indigenous population, with many, including many Jews, coming up to Victoria from San Francisco. The founding of the synagogue in Victoria in 1863 very much reflects the Jews' sense of themselves as part of Victoria's emerging white settler community and their relative acceptance with it. This broader acceptance of the larger white community and the synagogue's sense of itself as very much part of a white colonial project in Victoria is seen clearly when the synagogue behind me was dedicated on June 3rd, 1863, with very much public fanfare, both from Jews and non-Jews in the local community. There was a long procession, including congregants, but also members of local German, Scottish, and French cultural societies, the Naval Band, and the Victoria Masonic Lodge. Certainly, there were some Jews among the Masons, but primarily, as with the other cultural societies, mostly non-Jews. The procession wound its way through the city streets and then gathered at the site of the building for speeches and a formal cornerstone laying by the Masons. The congregation's vice president, Samuel Hoffman, spoke to this major occasion of the laying of, quote, the foundation of the first synagogue of Her Majesty's dominions on this side of the Pacific. Hoffman expressed the significance of the occasion in a pointed rhetorical question. Who would have thought, he asked, that in the space of 5 years since the founding of the colony, we should have a temple erected where then the Aborigines were the lords of the domain? Who would have dreamt, he continued, that in this isolated part of the globe, where ere now the foot of white men had hardly trod, there should spring up a comparatively large city, studded with magnificent edifices and inhabited by intelligent people, as in white people, he meant. The synagogue was indeed a founding colonial edifice in Victoria. In 1863, in fact, it was the only brick house of worship where the churches were still made of wood. It's also important to remember that in 1863, Indigenous people remained a majority of the territories claimed by the British colony, and the dedication of Congregation Emmanuel was part of their displacement. As we've discussed further in another publication we've done, Jordan and I, for this project, Jews held a tenuous position within the racial and religious hierarchies of early Victoria. We define them as white Jews, which they were called by at least a couple of the Christians at that time. So their middle-class status and relative whiteness made them much more acceptable to their white Christian neighbors than the Indigenous population and the Chinese immigrant population, who faced ongoing brutal and vicious racism and exclusion in that community. At the same time, members of this congregation were still Jews, not Christians, and they did face various episodes of anti-Semitism over the course of the 19th century. Despite this, and perhaps in part to buttress their position in the white community, Victoria's Jewish community actively contributed to the settler colonial project in various ways. For one thing, Jews were actively involved in local and colonial governments from early days. They served as mayors in Victoria and members of the local legislature. Also, unlike the Chinese and Indigenous peoples, local Jews were welcomed in white settler voluntary organizations like the Masons, local sports clubs, and women's organizations like the Women's Auxiliary, the Women's Local Council of Women, and so on. In the 1860s and 70s, Jewish merchants were also what were called principal Indian traders, in quotes, in the colony. That's what they were called. So these Jewish merchants were very active in selling and trading with Indigenous peoples for a range of goods, including alcohol, although the latter trade was illegal and was very damaging to Indigenous communities. By the 1880s, many Jewish merchants had moved on to become so-called, and again in quotes, Indian curio dealers, profiting from the sale of sacred Indigenous ceremonial objects, as well as everyday items that they sold to tourists and museums alike. These were very popular. These objects were bought at low prices or extracted from Indigenous communities at a time of growing Indigenous poverty, a time also when authorities had criminalized the Indigenous ceremonies where many of these sacred objects were used, and at a time when governments were actively denying Indigenous title, seizing land, and refusing to negotiate treaties. So as we've argued, the 19th and early 20th century Jewish community in Victoria was thus very much implicated in Canada's dispossession and attempted destruction of Indigenous peoples. And I turn it back to Jordan to move us closer to the present.
Thanks, Lynn. In the first decades of the 20th century, Victoria's Jewish community entered into prolonged decline, decades in which the congregation shrank and struggled to maintain a full-time rabbi. After the Second World War, a province-wide boom and a boom in Victoria brought reprieve. By the 1970s, Emmanuel had grown to over 100 families, and in 1982 completed a major restoration of the synagogue. By the turn of the 21st century, a wing was added to the original building of the synagogue, which by then had 200 member families. Still, Victoria's Jewish community in 2010 remained a fraction of that in centers of Canadian Jewish life, including Winnipeg. And Emmanuel remained until very recently the only house of worship for Jews in the city. And it was in this time of growth within the Jewish community, but also it's still rather extreme minority status as less than 1% of the city, that Holocaust commemoration emerged in Victoria. Holocaust remembrances in Victoria were founded by Rabbi Victor Reinstein, a charismatic leader of Congregation Emmanuel in the 1980s and 1990s. And Victor's on the call and may blush at the description of him as charismatic. Because he's here, I'll just add that his is not a kind of bombast charisma, but a kind of a quiet and very authentic charisma. Victor created the Kristallnacht memorial ceremony as a public-oriented event. By design, Kristallnacht audiences were intended to include members of the so-called general public. And this never changed and remains so today. However, and this is the key to the argument in this part of this piece, over time, the role assigned to that general public or imagined for that general public changed significantly, I think. At the outset, non-Jews were invited to the ceremonies as witnesses and as allies. Their role was to absorb the horrors of anti-Semitic violence, the horrors of the Holocaust, and to apply those lessons to present day and future human rights challenges. As in many other contexts, the Holocaust was used as a kind of analogical resource, a resource by which people might then undertake anti-racism today. And here's the key to the argument here. Over time, the role of non-Jews, of the general public in Kristallnacht commemoration in Victoria changed. The annual events remained an important facet of Jewish communal life in Victoria until approximately 2008, when the public commemorative practice seems to have begun to fade. After 2016, Kristallnacht events regained momentum, owing in part, I think, to a new approach. Several key organizers of the Kristallnacht commemoration came to understand the non-Jewish public as more than an audience or a witness to Jewish suffering called upon to apply its lessons. Instead, or rather, in addition, the general public was understood as carrying its own histories of violence into the room, from which Jews could also learn. And in some of these histories, Jews were implicated. Indeed, by 2019, when Richard Kuhl began the ceremony with an acknowledgement of Indigenous people, colonialism in British Columbia played a major role in the commemorations. And this emphasis of colonialism marked a major departure from prior events, in my view. And it's possible that, in fact, this emphasis has waned somewhat since COVID, with the online ceremonies have had a somewhat different feeling, I think. So that's something we could perhaps talk about if folks are curious about that after. Although in 2019, the histories of members of the general public, or rather specific members of groups within the non-Jewish community and Indigenous people in particular, were seen as worth teaching in the context of Holocaust commemoration. In this new changed observance, Jews were an audience charged with the responsibility of learning lessons from other horrors that were not their own, and then perhaps applying those lessons in their own human rights endeavors. This kind of learning was presented during Kristallnacht commemoration rather than in some other potential educational setting seems to me worth noting. In 2016, a newly founded committee of Congregation Emmanuel called the Victoria Shoah Project assumed responsibility for Kristallnacht commemoration in Victoria. And that organization immediately brought colonialism to the foreground. The centerpiece of their first commemorative program was a symbolic rebuilding of a stained glass window, or a kind of a symbol of a stained glass window. Notably, Chief Ron Sam of the Songhees Nation placed the first fragment into the window, and the second piece was placed by a Holocaust survivor. For several years thereafter, at least, colonialism featured prominently in the program, perhaps especially in 2019. After quieting the sanctuary in that year, Kuhl conjured ghosts. He remembered his mother, 11 years old in Amsterdam in 1938 on the eve of Kristallnacht. He spoke about his grandparents, murdered 4 years later. His cousins who remained in Europe, he said, live in a world of ghosts, the ghosts of Nazis and the ghosts of Jews of Amsterdam and the Netherlands. But Canada, too, Kuhl added, was a haunted place. The ghosts of past trauma are always around us, he said. And I'll quote him at length here. Even as the ghosts of the murdered Jews of Europe call to us across time and space, ghosts call out to us from the residential schools, from the smallpox-infected villages, from Skid Rows, from missing and murdered women and girls. They call to us for reconciliation, healing, and friendship and shalom. Next, Kuhl explained that Jewish members of the congregation, or of the audience rather, had responsibilities toward these past atrocities. Even though, he said, even though the post-war generations and descendants of the Nazis and their collaborators do not carry guilt because of the actions of their ancestors, they are responsible for remembering and for acting. And in the same way, he said, while none of us here is guilty of the crimes committed by those working in residential schools, we also have a responsibility for remembering and for acting. To understand Kuhl's injunction and the history of Kristallnacht in Victoria more broadly, we benefit from the notion of implication recently elaborated by UCLA scholar Michael Rothberg in his book, The Implicated Subject. Rothberg's ideas, I think, align closely with Kuhl's discussion of responsibility. This is what Rothberg writes. I do not believe that contemporary Germans are best understood as beneficiaries of the Shoah. Instead, they're implicated subjects, says Rothberg, whose responsibility is to reflect on and act against both histories and ongoing manifestations of injustice. Among implicated subjects, says Rothberg, are latecomers to history of perpetration, whose families may have arrived after the acts of perpetration themselves, who may feel distanced from the harms caused in a history that is not their own, but whose systemic legacies they nonetheless inherit. Kuhl's address in 2019 and recent Kristallnacht commemorations in Victoria in general also convey the message that, in addition to inheriting a history of colonialism, Jews in Victoria presently inhabit it. By referencing recent and ongoing violence against Indigenous women, foregrounding Indigenous participants in the ceremonies themselves, and emphasizing that Kristallnacht, quote, the first program created by the Shoah Project, is not solely about past events. The commemorations draw attention to a reality emphasized by scholars of settler colonialism in Canada, that the displacement of Indigenous people continues to this day. For Kuhl, the purpose of Holocaust commemoration is to convey that, quote, we're all in this together. A realization that for Jews, he says, emerges partly from recognition that, quote, we can be persecutors too. From such insights, suggests Rothberg, we can move together towards justice rather than separately in grievance. The recent approach to Kristallnacht commemoration in Victoria is in some ways, I'll argue, I'll try to sketch now, a significant departure from its origins. The Jewish community began to publicly remember the Holocaust in the 1980s due to the initiative of Rabbi Reinstein, who led the congregation from 1982 to 1988. He drafted the first programs of the two commemorative dates. Yom HaShoah ceremonies, as elsewhere, were convened each spring at the congregation's cemetery, and these were small events for the Jewish community itself, for the congregation largely. Kristallnacht in November, and again, like elsewhere, was a public event, typically held at the synagogue with a mixed audience of Jews and the general public. Reinstein invited guest speakers and chose readings. He personally led the events. The history of Kristallnacht commemoration in Victoria begins with Rabbi Reinstein. Reinstein was influenced and inspired by others, and in particular survivors who were living here in Victoria, some 24 of them when Reinstein arrived in the early 80s. He remembers himself as, quote, drawn to the horror of their experiences. He told me, I really was drawn deeply into the stories of survivors. Sometimes I almost felt like they were my own. Holocaust commemoration and education in Victoria had its roots in Reinstein's relationship with these survivors, as well as their own commitment to tell their stories in public. Holocaust commemoration was also an organized response to Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism. The 1980s saw the prolific trials, as many will know here, of two Holocaust deniers in Canada, Ernst Zundel and Jim Keekstra. In Victoria, Reinstein followed Keekstra's case in particular, collecting press clippings from the 1984 trial of the Eckville, Alberta teacher who told his students that Jews had exaggerated the harms against them and were likely disloyal to Canada. The rabbi was also concerned about local anti-Semitism in Victoria. In 1984, he collected and underlined a remarkable and offensive article in the local paper. The article, an op-ed, warned, quote, descendants of victims about the hazards of, quote, drawing the public's eye to time-worn misfortunes. And Jews in particular, the author thought, risked much in doing so. By and large, the author wrote, the world has forgiven the Jews for executing Christ. Better to leave historical skeletons in the closet, he suggested, than to draw them out. And Reinstein underlined these lines in the article, incredulous. I'm sure that they were being published locally. Kristallnacht commemoration was in those years a response to such sentiments. Local commemoration was also part of the larger movement in North America and globally to remember the Holocaust in public. The Victoria Jewish community first commemorated Kristallnacht in 1988, the 50th anniversary of the attacks, and a moment of commemoration in sites all over the world. Reinstein followed models developed elsewhere, including as distributed to local communities by the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles. In keeping with the vision of the Wiesenthal Center, Kristallnacht in Victoria was directed toward non-Jews as well as Jews. In one early commemoration, the rabbi reflected, "It is a comfort to share intimate pain and hopes and the ways and language of our faith in the presence of so many from the wider Victoria community." In 1993, Reinstein wrote Victoria Mayor David Turner, requesting a formal civic proclamation, again, which was common in other sites as well, marking the 55th anniversary of Kristallnacht. In addition to affirming the mass atrocities of the Holocaust and so combating denial, the proclamation also explained that Kristallnacht conveys, and this is quoting it, Kristallnacht conveys with unique urgency the responsibility of good people to speak out and act before racism begins its cancerous spread. The proclamation implored a vigilant public to combat the, quote, rise of racism and Holocaust denial in many places. That year, Reinstein also published an op-ed in the Victoria Times Colonist, in part to announce the keynote speaker that year, Canadian scholar Irving Abella, whose co-authored book, None is Too Many, revealed Canadian inaction during the Holocaust. In the op-ed, Reinstein wrote, "Silence in the face of evil is perpetration." He observed that Germans stood idle as synagogues burned in 1938. He wrote, "This is a compelling reason for looking closely at Kristallnacht and for remembering together as Jews and non-Jews. It is a question of moral responsibility, the challenge to love one's neighbor and not stand idly by their blood. By failing to respond, we desecrate our own humanity and deface the image of God." This message and its premises about the role of the general public in Kristallnacht commemoration as witnesses of this past called upon to act in the present and the future characterized the annual event. The memory of the Holocaust was intended to offer healing to the Jewish community and to serve as an anti-racist resource for the general public. In the same period, Reinstein wrote an acknowledgement of colonialism that he integrated into the weekly religious ceremony, the Shabbos services at the shul. He wrote a prayer for our country and inserted it into the services immediately following the reading of the Torah, and it is still inserted on in our Sfarim in the back. We have to turn to the back to get to that prayer that Victor wrote. In this early institutionalized land acknowledgement, congregants intoned, "May we honor with humility those who first dwelled on this land and learn from them the sacredness of earth and sky and water." Despite this gesture in the regular services toward reconciliation, it found no expression in Kristallnacht commemoration at the time. There was no hint within the ceremonies that Jews in Victoria could be, or indeed presently were, perpetrators of injustice. As was the case with Canadian society more generally, in the 1980s and 1990s, recognition of the complicity of Canadians in the brutalities of colonialism remained largely on the intellectual and political margins of Jewish communal practice. Eventually, Kristallnacht commemoration went into decline. Reinstein left Victoria in 1998, returning home to Boston, where he founded another congregation. After some years of activity, participation in the commemorative organization at the time began to flag, remembers one longtime member. On some issues, the leadership was divided, and more generally, its energy just waned. Fewer people volunteered to undertake outreach or to organize the events. Meanwhile, many survivors in the community died. The ceremonies could no longer rely upon their presence to draw an audience or to inspire. The congregation of Victoria, like those elsewhere, confronted the prospect of commemoration without testimony. By the 2010s, by the early 2010s, leading members of the Jewish community felt that Holocaust commemoration in the city had lost its way. Misha Menzer, the child of survivors, arrived to Victoria in 2010. As he had when he lived in Ottawa and Vancouver, Menzer attended the commemorative events in Victoria. This is what he said. After going a couple of times, it was the same. Kristallnacht, there were images of skeletons and crematoria. Yom HaShoah was heavy. It was us against the world, like we're under siege and we have to build walls. Another member of the congregation at the time, Elisheva Gray, felt similarly. As she recalled, Kristallnacht involved, quote, a slide presentation, images showing the corpses from the concentration camps. Richard Kuhl, the leader in 2019, remembers, quote, piles of bodies. Although both Kuhl and Gray have studied the history intensively and recognize the horrific realities that such photographs depict, they both worried that in this context, those presentations alienated attendees rather than encouraging engaged commemoration. There were also in these years disagreements among organizers about the place of other victims, including homosexuals, in Holocaust memory, and questions about the appropriateness of the Israeli national anthem within the ceremony. So basically it deteriorated, remembers Menzer. It was a very unpleasant experience and really counterproductive. These issues also led to declining attendance. Gray recalls noticing that the numbers of people coming to these events, she said, were getting quite minimal, and it was really making us sad. Menzer paints a similar picture. My children are going to enter the house and perhaps enter the presentation. Menzer paints a similar picture, sparsely attended events, depressing affairs. We're losing it, he remembers telling another child of survivors. People are not going. It's a shanda. It's a shame for what our families experienced. Ed Fitch had similar observations at the time, remembering that, quote, maybe it got into a rut. These concerns coalesced within a group that didn't feel that this was how people would connect with the history of the Holocaust. In the same period, questions surrounding the history and current realities of colonialism became increasingly central to Canadian political discussion and public discussion, perhaps especially in British Columbia. And it was in this context that Menzer, Gray, Kuhl, and others founded the Victoria Shoah Project and assumed control of the Kristallnacht and Yom HaShoah commemorations in 2016. They eliminated the slideshow and resumed the former practice of actively soliciting outsiders to participate in the ceremony. Rabbi Harry Breckner, a successor to Reinstein at Congregation Emmanuel, gathered local faith and indigenous leaders at Kristallnacht commemorations to take a joint pledge against hatred. Notably, the premises of outreach shifted subtly with the new group. The conviction that outsiders might bear witness to the Holocaust and act against other forms of racism did persist, but it was accompanied by another vision. By inviting Chief Ron Sam to lay the first shard of glass into the shattered window that headlined the its first event, by raising the ghosts of colonial genocide, the organizers of Kristallnacht communicated that outsiders were not merely present to bear witness to Jewish tragedy. Rather, these outsiders, and indigenous people in particular, now got a place at the front of the room, conveying their own histories of injustice. And as a result, Jewish attendees were also repositioned. They were still present to remember the Holocaust in the company of the wider public, but also to serve as an audience to and take responsibility for the harms of colonialism in Canada. In this new vision of the event, Jews were enjoined to speak out against histories and ongoing harms in which they themselves were seen as complicit. This approach, exemplified in Kuhl's 2019 Kristallnacht speech, has been, I think, controversial. I'd say here controversial, but I think something less than controversial. It's at least been debated within the Jewish community. Tensions remain high between members of the Shoah Project and former organizers of the Kristallnacht commemorations. And even among members of the Shoah Project, the foregrounding of colonialism and with it Jewish implication in historical violence is not without detractors. Some of these detractors, or these detractors tend to believe, I should say, that the Holocaust should be applied to other injustices. So they continue to see it as an analogical resource and not isolated from other historical injustices. And in this sense, the longstanding approach of Rabbi Reinstein didn't trouble them. But the inclusion of other histories of violence, colonialism, and racism as parallels to the Holocaust, and the suggestion of some level of Jewish responsibility for these injustices, at least in the context of Holocaust commemoration, is for some a step too far. Despite these debates, however, recent commemorative events have been compelling. Kristallnacht commemorations have had an upsurge of participation. The commemorations feel alive, relevant, and activist. Often in the absence of survivors, their children have implored audiences of Jews and non-Jews in Victoria to see themselves as responsible for ongoing injustices that can and should be addressed now. The Premier and other dignitaries attend in part because the event feels relevant today. Jewish youth groups participate and take inspiration. A broader vision that both acknowledges Jews as victims of violent racism and also asks them to take responsibility for their roles in the victimization of others has breathed new life into Kristallnacht commemoration in Victoria. By way of a final reflection before Q&A, I want to shift to a somewhat more personal tone, or we shift to a personal tone, I'll speak for me and Lynne, and sound perhaps a note of caution. We're both members of Victoria's Jewish community and regular attendees of the Kristallnacht commemoration. Lynne's been part of the community since the early 1990s. I've been here since the early 2000s, and I've been a member of the Victoria Shoah Project since 2018. So I helped to organize these events. We approached the topic then from the inside, and our concerns emerged from a perspective of both admiration for and participation in recent commemorative events. Nonetheless, we feel there may be important questions to raise. In a recent discussion of the Jewish commemorative events in Victoria, of which I was a part, and of connections among injustices more broadly, a University of Victoria colleague, Christine Tsai, an Ojibwe Anishinaabe poet, seemed puzzled by what I was describing to her, puzzled by, say, Rick Kuhl's speech in 2019. After a pause, she reflected that she was trying to figure out what these connections and what the invocation of Indigenous ghosts at a Holocaust commemoration, what these acts could mean for her, or what work they could do for the people she works for and with. What does this connection do for me or for us, she seemed to ask. And that question left me uneasy. It points to a certain asymmetry. Arguably, the connection between Kristallnacht commemoration and colonialism has breathed life into these commemorative events in Victoria. That connection has made Jewish commemorative practice feel meaningful and currently relevant. Rather than a grim catalog of a terrible period in our own history, commemoration feels full of possibility, of new ways of seeing Jewish history in relation to Canada's past. And it comes to feel that way by drawing other histories of terror, of residential schools, smallpox, missing and murdered Indigenous women into the room. These stories then, at least arguably, do work for Jewish commemorative practice. The Jewish community is putting that history to use. Many in the Jewish community, the two of us included, would not attend a slideshow of corpses. But we do show up, and I bring my children, to hear how relevant our history is to the ongoing current challenge of colonialism in our own community. After talking with our colleague Christine, I came to wonder, What if this form of remembrance is another use of Indigenous people rather than an answer to the challenge of colonialism? Can the practice actually deliver some form of justice? If Kristallnacht is to be an answer, Kristallnacht commemoration is to be an answer to the challenges of systemic racism in Canada, then we join our colleague Christine in asking how. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions, which Lynne and I will endeavor to answer.
Thank you very much, Jordan. Thank you very much, Lynne. This very interesting and challenging paper, which both reports and provides a factual background and raises some very troubling and very complex questions for the for the moment. When I just checked a moment ago, there we go. People are still digesting this or figuring out how to react. So let me ask. Let me start by asking a question. Why Kristallnacht became the focus of major commemoration in Victoria and not Yom HaShoah, which has been the focus, the major focus in Winnipeg and I think most other places. It's a little surprise to me. It was surprising.
Dan, are the Yom HaShoah events in Winnipeg, are they oriented toward a wider public as well?
They certainly draw on a wider public, but they are not oriented in their structure that way.
Yeah, our events aren't small actually for Yom HaShoah. We've recently, I don't know, there's kind of less of a head counting in a way, I think, because it is more internal. So I know I put out the chairs for Yom HaShoah, so I know we do it in the cemetery, so we have those folding chairs. So like this past year, for example, I was running and putting out more and more chairs as people came in. So I wouldn't say that it's not a vibrant event, and we have had some folks from outside the community come. But for whatever reason, and I don't know whether the participant, I don't know if Victor's still here, but for whatever reason, it really has always been the case that it's been regarded, I think, by organizers as an internal event, an opportunity for kind of collective mourning. It's, you know, it being in the cemetery, and there's a Holocaust memorial that was created in the 1980s there as well. It has an inward, a more inward-looking feel to it, I would say, the event. So I don't mean to suggest that it's not been important in Victoria. It's rather, I came to focus on Kristallnacht because my interest is in part public history and how histories are conveyed to various publics. And so for me, the orientation of Kristallnacht here toward that wider public was what drew my interest to analyze. I attend both, but as a historian, drew my interest.
Bell has just reminded me that there has been Indigenous participation in the Megillat HaShoah readings of the Holocaust scroll. A number of different people are invited to read sections of it, and this includes, as you see.
And that what ceremony is that a part of?
It's the Yom HaShoah ceremony. Bell, if you want to join in, please do. And Penny Switzer, as a panelist, you can set yourself and ask it in person. The structure of the webinar allows the panelists to get on, so I would invite Paul, Penny, and Bell and others if they have a comment or a question to please do it. For
I might
others,
just add, Dan, in relation to that last comment of bells in relation to the Yom HaShoah ceremony. I mean, to my understanding, there's been very little analysis of how these observances have changed over time in Canada, or in fact, actually elsewhere. So we tried to make some effort to understand what was going on elsewhere when we were working on this piece, and the editors of the journal in which we published it, wanted to know more about other places in Canada. And so we did a kind of a quick effort to try and understand that. But I think they're really dynamic ceremonies. Obviously, they're usually informally organized by a committee that can make changes as they wish and introduce. So that makes them a really interesting and exciting form of public history, I think, as opposed to a museum where you kind of put it up and it's there. These can be reinvented every year. And it's really interesting to hear that that's the case in Winnipeg. And, I'd be curious to hear more about that.
So just to explain in a nutshell, Megillat HaShoah is the only liturgical observance of the Shoah. It's a scroll written in 5 chapters, and what we do differently in Winnipeg is we do it as an interfaith reading. So we invite people from various communities, and throughout the years, people from certain individuals from the Indigenous community have been invited to participate, and they've always commented how moving this is and how meaningful it is to their own history. And often they will struggle emotionally, to get through the reading. And at one point, the individual who is today the leader of the provincial opposition said that he wished that someone would write a similar piece for the Indigenous community. The other thing that we've done several times is, so we've had once a year, a Holocaust Symposium for high school students. And in the morning, a Holocaust speaker would talk. And before COVID, in the afternoon, a survivor of another genocide. But several times we've had Indigenous survivors of residential school. We've had Senator Sinclair twice. We've had his son Negan Sinclair just last year, actually, in a virtual program in conversation with a survivor, which was also interesting. We had the late Theodore Fontaine in 2020. And we also had Robbie Weisman from Vancouver, who is an honorary witness, along with Murray Sinclair. So these have been really moving and important exchanges, I think.
There's several questions have begun to come in, but I'll first, Victor Reinstein says, yes, I am here, and filled with thoughts and memories and appreciation to both of you. Paul, if you'd like to ask your question now, I'll perceive it. If you don't want to do it in person, you can send it on the Q&A line. While you're getting ready, Jeremy.
Yeah, I think I'd rather
Marin,
defer.
who is the curator of Holocaust and other subjects at the Museum, Human Rights Museum, asks, have you seen examples of commemorative events by and for other atrocity-affected communities that incorporate Jewish or Holocaust survivor perspectives, or other atrocity-affected communities more broadly? So that is, including other experiences of atrocities within the context of a specific community commemoration. If you pull up your Q&A line, you can see that it's, my reading may not make it entirely clear, but so you can read it as well as listen to me.
Do you have any thoughts on this one, Lynne? Have you seen anything like that? No, you're muted, yeah.
Yeah, but no, I don't think I have. I mean, you read about it, right? You read about things like the Rwandan genocide being compared to the Holocaust, for instance, but I haven't seen any such commemorations, or the Armenian genocide. So in print, you see it, but.
One of the things, and also in relation to the last comment, I mean, we see Holocaust witnesses, and I think Robbie Weissman, I think, was that what Bell was suggesting, offering testimony and support in the context of truth and reconciliation in Canada. So certainly there are events and educational events wherein, you know, these connections are made and Holocaust survivors might be drawn in. I don't know of that many others. One of the things I was trying to grapple with in this piece is whether commemoration is a specific kind of public event that makes the invocation of you know, of these kinds of comparisons, or the presence of Indigenous presenters and so on, makes it different. You know, I'm not sure, but I think it's that question that our colleague had. You know, why in a memorial, you know, in a commemorative event, would our history be being brought up? And I think her suggestion in response to Jeremy's comment, I think her suggestion was, you know, that wouldn't be something that would occur within, say, the Ojibwe community, to, if they were at a ceremonial event of that kind in relation to their own history, to draw in, say, the Holocaust. And so that was sort of what, but there are other contexts like truth and reconciliation where that history has been seen as relevant. So.
Penny, if you'd like to unmute yourself, please go ahead and ask your question.
Sure, thanks, Dan. So my question is not entirely to the point of your presentation, but so I get your main point that somehow introducing the outside communities to provide a perspective on other atrocities and injustice perpetrated in other communities, perhaps even the role that the Jewish community played in that somehow that has revitalized the Kristallnacht commemoration, where you went from a commemoration that was losing interest among the community to one that was gaining interest. But in doing so, it's sort of I take the point of one of the other questioners that it somehow loses some of its uniqueness, and there has been a lot of debate and commentary whether the Holocaust itself should be compared with any other world tragedy. I mean, it becomes almost trite. Some of these comparisons, when anything bad happens, someone says, well, it's like the Holocaust. And so we have to somehow, in my mind, also preserve the uniqueness of the Holocaust in history. And I worry a little bit that conflating it with other tragedies detracts from the uniqueness of its commemoration.
I think Jordan probably has more than I to say about that, but I would say that that is part of the debate in Victoria, even within the Shoah project. Would you agree, Jordan?
Yeah, so that was the concern expressed by some members of the Shoah project, and some who kind of moved away from more active participation, and not necessarily for that reason, but who nonetheless moved a bit away from active participation in the organization. And I think that would be a point of difference between the prior organizers and the current organizers. Is yeah, and so. Yeah, for my own part, I guess I've found there's you know, I think in some ways some form of comparison is entailed in even the claim of uniqueness. That somehow to claim the uniqueness, it sort of draws into view those other instances of genocide and harm. And on the other hand, you know, some organizers certainly of the events who defend this practice would maintain that the specificity of the Holocaust has always been preserved in these efforts to draw other histories of injustice into the room. And so I guess that's within the context of kind of a ceremonial event like this, I suppose that's in a sense depends on each audience member, whether to a certain degree, whether they lead the event having a sense that yes, this has been uniquely a commemoration of this particular harm. Especially, we do have many children of survivors in the community for whom the event has that very personal resonance in relation to the memory of their grandparents and their parents who struggled through having grown up being the children of survivors. So I think an event that lost that component would really do harm to those people in a sense who come to the ceremonies for that reason. And I think the organizers are sensitive to that.
The question from Sharon Graham, who, well, in a sense, sat where you in 2020, where you do now. She was the winner then. She asks whether the must Shoah commemorations always be didactic. What about just bearing witness for the sake of the victim's memory?
Yeah, and I think definitely, I tried to convey, but Victor conveys, there's oral histories associated with this project that are available on the University of Victoria website, library website, and you can find them through the article as well. And for me, at least, I spent a day with Victor in Boston and just met him there, and it was a really profound experience for me. And Victor spoke at great length about the survivors, and I was only barely able to convey the feeling that he had around that topic in his that's in that interview and the stories of those survivors. So certainly, I think in the early history of Kristallnacht in Victoria, it was also about honoring those survivors, and even remains still. We have some survivors in the community still, but also children of survivors remains that as well. But I think my sense of these public-facing events has been that they always have had, and especially since kind of their emergence into what I would think of as the public historical mainstream in the 1980s in Canada and the US and really globally, have always had a strong didactic component. Should they? I'm not sure, I guess, but certainly that has, I think, always been a part of what those public-facing ceremonies have intended to teach lessons.
I'm surprised that the commemorations were losing steam in 2008, because that has not been our experience here, and a generally interest and concern with the Holocaust has continued to grow. So that seems, I wonder what accounts for that, whether there are any structural questions in the makeup of the community, or is there any what explanation can we have for it? Is Victoria unusual from what you've seen, and why, if you can?
Yeah, again, to my knowledge, we don't have good historical, or I guess this is kind of work in public history, say, public historical accounts of commemorative events as dynamic community practices over time. So I don't think we have really a strong basis for making claims about the waxing and waning and shifts in practice, shifts in popularity across different sites. So anecdotally, I don't know. I haven't been myself involved in any commemorative organization except for the one here, and I wasn't following those events in the early 2000s. The account I have is mostly from the folks who were involved in the new approaches of the mid 2010s, and so can report mostly their perspective that the events were alienating viewers or losing steam, or that there were some organizational problems within the organizing committee and so on. But I can't really offer any meaningful comparative assessment of that, or really even a detailed analysis of really what happened in Victoria.
Ben Bonner had a comment, but unfortunately the mechanics of the webinar seem to have gotten in the way. Is it possible for you, Ben, to type it in quickly?
No, but I think, oh, okay, so now I'm unmuted.
Oh, you're on now. I didn't realize that was possible.
Yes. No. Okay, so you can see me, but you can hear me. So I'm just introducing myself, Ben Bader, at the University of Manitoba in history and Jewish history, and I've done some work on Holocaust commemoration or memory. Oh, now I can even join as a panelist.
Yeah, please go ahead, Ben. Now there you are, in person. Unmute yourself.
Okay. No, I unmuted. Okay, so oops. I believe that first of all, thank you. This has been incredibly, really, really very, very interesting and fascinating. What I'm wondering is whether some of, what you come up against here in this discussion is has to do with the mode of commemoration, and that commemoration goes along with a type of, I call it, almost like a sacralization that levels specifics and that it levels complexity. And in this particular, this North American and Canadian mode of Holocaust commemoration, both survivors and of course also are murdered become sort of these innocent, sort of celebrated, one-dimensional, victims. And what you seem to be doing is sort of bringing in a complexity that sort of pushes against the sacralization. For the better or the worse. You might want it, right? So victims can, have sort of regain agency, can also be implicated in, oppressions of others, can implicate it. So you have a sort of you sort of recapture historical complexity that is sort of vacated in these modes of commemoration. And so I'm wondering whether whether that is part of what is going on here.
No, I think thank you, Ben, for that observation. I think for Rick Kuhl, who I quoted at length there and really was the center of that 2019 ceremony. So he's someone who's done a lot of research on his own family that has a very complex and kind of a history that somewhat undermines a kind of angelic view of survivors and so on. So I think probably I would credit those organizers as I think you're right, trying to introduce that complexity, which I've thought of more in terms of the audience. But I suppose you're right that it might also reflect a kind of more complex view that Rick has of who in any event the victims of the Holocaust were. But I saw Lynne also ready to jump in on this one. So
yeah, I'm thinking less of agency of victims of the Holocaust, although as Jordan said, some of those stories can have some complexity, but more of a bit the story that I talked about a bit at the beginning, that for the Jewish community in Victoria, at least, to just, if they're doing Holocaust commemoration, then they're obviously, and I can speak for myself, if it's just about the Holocaust, then one identifies, you know, as a Jew, as someone who can be a victim of anti-Semitism, and there isn't a recognition of potential complicity in other kinds of you know, racist violence, colonial violence. So in Victoria, it's not just in Victoria, but the Victoria Jewish community has these really complex roots. And the story that I was talking about is also more complex because part of the anti-Semitism against Jews in 19th century Victoria is because they have dealings with Indigenous people, and the white Christians don't actually like that because they just want all the Indigenous people out of town. So it's very complicated, but they certainly are implicated in, and our current Rabbi Harry Breckner, wants the community to grapple with this history as part of recognizing that we as Jews have a history, a long history, the Holocaust, but before that and since, of victimization, but we also have to deal with this much more complex history of where we are complicit in other forms of violence. So I don't know if that helps.
I think as Ben was suggesting, I mean, that story that Lynne is telling, or that portrait that Lynne is telling, is a more human, you know, is renders Jews historically as more fully people. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think that's a fitting end to a very interesting presentation and a lively discussion afterwards. I would really I thank the authors of the paper. I thank Lynne and Jordan for your very interesting and thought-provoking raising these issues is on the forefront. It's on the leading edge of various historical and social thoughts. So we thank you very much for doing it. And just so well, we thank the questioners for asking interesting questions and making interesting comments. We're very grateful to the Switzer family for having created the situation in which this and other papers have been presented to of great benefit to the Jewish Heritage Center, and I think to the Winnipeg Jewish community. And I also thank the 3 anonymous expert jurors for their choice. Finally, I thank Belle Jarniecki, Executive Director of the Heritage, for the administrative work that she put in on this, and her technical expertise in handling this matter. Belle is particularly interested in this. She's the chair of the Holocaust Education Committee of the Jewish Heritage Center, and she's the Canadian delegate to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. So I will now thank everyone and turn the program over to Belle to tell us about upcoming programs, many of which coincidentally deal with the Holocaust.
Thank you very much, Dan, and
And she will finish up.
Thank you, Jordan and Lynne, for that really extraordinary presentation. We have, as Dan mentioned, a number of interesting programs coming up in the next month and a half. In chronological order, on October 12th at 7 p.m. in the Burney Theatre, an evening with Marcia Lederman, who is an opinion columnist with the Globe and Mail and author of Kiss the Red Stairs, The Holocaust Once Removed, in conversation with me. Tickets are $12 at the door or online through thinair.ca. On November 10th at 7 p.m. in the Burney Theatre, we will be marking Kristallnacht with a launch of the Hans Volpe exhibit and accompanying program. Hans Volpe was a Holocaust survivor who joined the Royal Winnipeg Rifles. Free admission, but registration, which will be available soon, is required. Please see our website under events and programs. And this is a program in partnership with the Jewish Federation of Winnipeg. On November 15th, again at 7 p.m. in the Burney Theatre, the students of the Westwood Historical Society, these are high school students, will be presenting their film, Truth Against Distortion, Survivors Speak Out Against Hate. The film was made under the direction of their award-winning teacher, Kelly Hebert, and students interviewed local Holocaust survivors and produced a film focusing on survivor experiences and the current rise in anti-Semitism and Holocaust distortion. This program is in partnership with the Westwood Historical Society and the Rady JCC Tarbut Festival of Culture. Again, registration required through the Rady JCC, but there's free admission. And the Jewish Heritage Center was pleased to provide guidance to Kelly Hebert, the teacher, and his students throughout the production and editing of the film. On November 23rd, the Faces of Hope, in partnership with Federation, will be the unveiling of an exhibit of portraits of local Holocaust survivors with a reception to follow, free admission and registration through Federation. And finally, on December 4th, which is a Sunday at 2 p.m. in the Bruni Theater, we will be presenting Crossing the River, the Fink Family Story. This is a film about the world's oldest living Holocaust survivor siblings, Anne Novak, Sally Singer, Ruth Zimmer, and Saul Fink, all of Winnipeg, with director Alan Novak. Free admission, but registration required. Please see our website for further details. And I hand it back to Dan to end the evening. I see Dan is not, well, I think he's coming up. There he is.
I think you summed it up, and I will just thank everybody once again, and wish you a Shana Tova, getting a few days ahead of things. And next year, when the student prize is awarded.
Thank you, Dan. And just a reminder, if anyone you know who might want to see this film and this presentation wasn't available tonight, we will be putting it onto our YouTube channel, hopefully by tomorrow. Thank you very much, and good night.
Thank you.